Good afternoon. Welcome to the TBA Zoom room. We are delighted to host Fred Moten with a conference titled The Defense of Two-Dimensionality. This conference is part of a larger and exciting project organized by Paula Caspão and hosted by TBA. The Expanded Practices All Over cycle, a space for collective reflection around the expression expanded practices. And it was supposed to have taken place in April last year following a workshop. The conference was postponed to the 7th of July 2021 today and was supposed to happen live in presence. Well, hopefully next year we will be able to welcome Fred Moten in presence together with Stefan Uharni for a new conference and workshop organized by Paula Caspão still, and thus continuing a conversation with two authors who we hope to have time to read and get to know better throughout the year. Fred Moten teaches Black Studies, Critical Theory, Performance Studies, and Poetics in the Department of Performance Studies at NYU, New York University. He is the author of a 3-volume collection of essays whose general title is Consent Not to Be a Single Being, from 2017, To Service Port, 2016, The Little Edges, 2015, The Field Trio, 2014, B. Jenkins, 2010, Euchan's Tavern, and finally, In the Break, The Aesthetics of Black Radical Tradition from 2003. Moten is also co-author with Stefan Uharni of The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study from 2013, and A Poetics of the Undercommons from 2016, and with Wu Tsang of Who Touched Me. I would also like to call your attention to the fact that this conference in English is being recorded and broadcast in streaming. That's why I asked you all to wait 5 minutes. So this conference is being recorded and broadcast in streaming, being available live on our Facebook page and at teatrodobairroalto.pt. We kindly ask everyone to turn off their microphones and cameras if they don't want to show up. We will open for voice and written questions here in the Zoom chat and in the Facebook and YouTube comments and at the end. Thank you. I will now give the floor to Paula Caspão, whom I thank for organizing this event. Paula.
Mike, thank you so much, Anna, for opening this today and for all the support and sparkle and friendship throughout this long process of organizing and rescheduling this encounter with Fred in Lisbon, or almost in Lisbon. I also want to thank, well, first of all, I want to thank the people who are here that I can see. I see a lot of people that I know. And although my heart is pounding because I'm really excited and nervous, as I always get in these situations, I am really touched. I also want to thank Francisco Frazão, Artistic Director of TBA Theater, for having hosted the Expanded Practices cycle since November 2019 in partnership with the Center for Theater Studies of the University of Lisbon. And I also want to thank the Center for Theater Studies itself, in particular the colleagues and the students with whom I have been discussing and experimenting collective study practices throughout these last years and who make my life beautiful in so many ways. I also absolutely want to thank everyone in the production and communication teams of the theater and the Center for Theater Studies. So now I need to share my screen. To start to say to Fred that I don't know how to say my gratitude to you for having accepted this invitation, but more widely for the infinite ways in which your writing, feel, think, says, all this in one word, feel, think, says, in the compression that Adrian Ithfield came up with to introduce your work before your lecture on blackness and non-performance at the Afterlives conference back in 2015. And also picking from a vast number of reasons to thank you, may I mention the beautifully intriguing laughs with which you sometimes incomplete what you're saying. I might, I fantasize about compiling the laughs from the lectures that are online available, but this would be a little bit of an extractive something to make a song out of it. I want to apologize for having a very bad relationship with formal introductions, partly because I truly suck at doing them. So this thing that I am trying by way of obliquity comes as an attempt to install some conversational atmosphere, or at least a sense of the moves implicated in textuality as social space, with a lot of different stuff rubbing off one another. And this is where I also need to thank the friends with whom I have been reading fragments of your works this last month, Fred. And the friends are Alix Enoudi, Kim Pujol, Valentina Desideri, and Joachim Hamou. By the way, the experimental reading we have been doing together would have been some kind of prelude to your workshop last year in April, had it really happened. What's on the screen is an excerpt of a long-term process, a very partial materialization of it that I edited 2 weeks ago, and this is to be continued in many different ways. It's called Mute Poem for Entangled Reading, and it took shape in the folds and interstices of multiple partial readings, rereadings, misreadings of beloved texts and images as they played their ways hanging out with us. The texts are by Anne Boyer, Giulia Palladini, Ariella Aisha Azulay, Avery Gordon, Kathleen Stewart, Lauren Berlant, Delugosa Osunda, Jason Pine, Susan Lapselter, Tina Kempt, Françoise Vergès, Saidia Hartman, Fred Moten, Stefano Harney. As Valentina said when I finished the editing, it kind of feels like a celebration of all of you by way of I also need to thank Vitória Auer, Francisco Silva, and Nuno Cerqueira, who translated the matched pair of poems that Fred sent us for the program. One with the title Tiling Lining Notes, translated as Notas de Ladrilhar, de Forrar, and two, Tiling Lining Notes, translated as Notas de Ladrilhar, de Calcificar. Of which I feel like trying a little bit of something, tile or fleck, as if ladrilho ou borrão, como se, daub or stroke, but a cut, manchado ou pincelado, mas corte, of blue, flash-cut glance de azul, carne cortada vislumbre de blue for train. In the general murder, no homicídio geral, all but mute, for Amadou Diallo. You have to get too close. You have to get, tens de chegar so close to see the glance and shine tão perto, para ver o reflexo e o brilho. You get too close. Chegas demasiado perto to see the glint in flames. Read, para ver o clarão em chamas, ler the braille of trembling, o braille de tremor. Through the sea of inflection. Éclat, éclat, et clinger, por entre o mar da intuação. I don't know how to read poetry. I am delighted to announce that Vitória and Francisco are the founders of Maio Maio, a new independent edition house that decided to start their activity by editing a Portuguese translation of the Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study, and a Poetics of the Undercommons. So Mute Poem got some soundtracks today, very wild ones. Fred, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Paula, and also Federico and Anna and all the people who are responsible for me being able to be with you all here today. I very much wish it were in person, but I'm sure that will happen soon, maybe next summer, I hope, and I'll be glad to meet and embrace you all when I can, in real life, so to speak. So I think what I have today might, well, I'm just going to get started, but with just a couple prefatory remarks. One is that unfortunately, I'm talking with you today about music and painting in a way that actually brings to mind an old essay by Adorno called On Some Relationships Between Music and Painting. I don't know that I'm talking about relationships between music and painting, but I am talking about music and painting. And unfortunately, what that means is that I'm reducing to words what you ought to experience as sound and image. But because of the sort of technical difficulties of presenting to you from where I am, it seemed like it made the most sense to proceed without trying to give sounds and images, without trying to play some of the music that I am thinking of and trying to think with, as well as the images, particularly of the work of a great Afro-American painter named Jack Whitten, who I think is maybe, the key figure in the talk that I'm going to give. So I apologize about that, but I also want to encourage all of you to search, and it won't take very long, not only to find instances of Whitten's work, but also of the music that I'll mention, some of the people being, you know, particularly John Coltrane, but some others as well. Also Milford Graves, great percussionist. And the reason why I don't feel completely bad about not showing the images from Whitten is because images on a screen or even in a book just simply don't do justice on any level to the turbulence and the sort of topographical complexity of his work, which is precisely what it is that I am hoping to talk about today. Okay, so that's the main prefatory remark, and here's another, which is that what I'm going to offer you today is in 3 parts, or in or on 3 measures, and they reflect ongoing projects and obsessions that you might, and what you might consider these remarks is as a kind of an ongoing song and dance of prose and verse in criticism, and the movement from prose to verse is part of where I'm going today. Anyway, here's the first part, and it's just an overview of the 3 parts of this, the 3 themes or 3 measures of the talk. 1, the problem or chance of two-dimensionality, which I approach by way of the physicist Leonard Susskind. It provides a way of thinking about the character of physical, he provides a way of thinking about the character of physical reality. And he gives a way of showing how physical reality might illuminate the very idea of fictional character. At stake is the unethical brutality of the reduction of certain persons to two-dimensionality, and the ethical chance of refusing the fantasy of 3-dimensionality, which bears so much of the history of vicious raciality, sexuation, and class formation in the name of and in the very idea of the human. I think since I gave you the title, which is A Defense of Two-Dimensionality, and since renewing my still very small and inadequate knowledge of geometry, I'm interested not so much in a defense of two-dimensionality as in an advocacy for what now I want to call pan-dimensionality. I want the prefix pan to indicate a rich interaction between all and nothing. And I also wanted to bear a certain celebratory aura too, so that if you hear in the prefix pan, you know, the name of the god Pan, or even better, if you hear the specific kind of carnival music that emerges from Trinidad when Trinidadians discovered the sonic qualities that could be induced from old oil drums, then I would be glad for you to hear that too. The second measure is already implied in the first. Oh, and one thing before I continue, the other key figure besides Susskind, who I'm thinking of, although here it's mostly implicitly, is a great literary critic named Marta Figlerovich, who writes in a very cool way about the notion of dimensionality in literary characters, in fictional characters, in the novel especially. Anyway, the second measure is already implied in the first and has to do with my attempt to raise this question. What if our ethics, epistemology, and aesthetics were understood to derive not from Euclidean geometry and Newtonian mechanics, but rather from Riemannian geometry and quantum, or more specifically, Bohrian mechanics? For me, this question is tied to the general and para-ontological, or perhaps more precisely, because severely, non-ontological or ontological question concerning blackness. At stake is a disruption of the ways metaphysics might be said to follow from physics. That is to say, what I'm interested in with regard to quantum mechanics, and more specifically, the notion of indeterminacy that is given there, is the resistance or refusal of metaphysics that it bears, as opposed to the ways that the Euclid, Aristotle, Newton line seems of necessity to culminate in or constitute a prolegomena to Kant's metaphysics, which moves by way of and refines the structures of raciality, sexuation, and class formation that his work codifies. In this regard, the refusal of ontology is more precisely understood as a refusal of the political economy of properly three-dimensional human individuation. It is a refusal, in other words, of proper ontopolitical economy. Blackness, or pan-dimensionality, is another word for that, or other words for that refusal. In order to get at this improper and illegitimate, but still, I think, necessary and true way of thinking about physics and geometry, I try to approach and learn from the work of physicist Karen Barad, and implicitly, but everywhere, mathematician Fernando Zalamea, sociologist Denise Ferreira da Silva, and the rest of my friends at the Institute for Physical Sociality. The third measure, where investigation of the aesthetic sociality of Blackness, as Laura Harris puts it, comes in the sections on the painter Jack Whitten. I'm interested in how his practice activates pan-dimensionality against and through the grain of the history of painting, especially as that history is understood to oscillate between the valorization of flatness and the imperative not simply to represent, but also to invent three-dimensionality. For me, Whitten doesn't so much exemplify, but studiously and devotedly practices pan-dimensionality, which I also like to call surfacing, in the dynamic attention to the dynamics of surface, a key term for Euclidean geometry, whose meaning Riemannian geometry and the topological turn radically alters. Whitten offers in his careful performative and afformative intrafacial refusal of the opposition of pigment and surface just this practice. For me, this is about what might be called the phonic substance and hapticality, as much as what might be called the visually insubstantial out-of-touchness of Whitten's paintings. This is not meant to imply some blanket refusal of the visual, say, on the grounds of its inherent anti-Blackness. It is rather about how the visual folds into the general sensual field. If visuality is anti-Black, it is so only in isolation and only within the constrained, partnered oscillation between determination and uncertainty. I don't know if there will be time or if this is the place, but this would be the way that one might approach a fruitful distinction between contingency and chance, i.e., between the imposition of precarity and the openness of and openness to the alternative. The question of sound and music brings us back to the question of gravity, where we begin by way of Susskind, because of this interesting musicological tendency over the past century to speak of tonality as if it bore the assumed natural facticity of gravity in the way that Newton understands it. Pan-dimensionality in this regard has a relation to the pantonality, which we might think of as connected to the fugitivity and not so much the emancipation of dissonance. So that's the first part. The second part is an elaboration of that. So consider the mystery of applying pigment to surface through the interfacial layer of a medium. Let such consideration be intensified when the medium, already infused with the pigment it bears, is made surface too, by way of traversal exertions after the paint has been applied. The visual and the oral are epiphenomena of touch, the irreducible tactility that is forgiven in sight and sound. There's this continual displacement of the interfacial layer, or of interfaciality, which portraiture can't capture. Consider also that nothing is no more the absence of matter than silence is the absence of sound. Nothing is not the same as nothingness, which is a concept, an effect of conceptual distancing, the mark that implies an overview. Nothing implies a kind of involvement, an active or inactive entanglement in dislocation. Is that what Karen Barad calls agential realism? Are we tangled up in nothing as if it were blue, blue being all but black, as Bob Dylan plus Glenn Ligon might say? Is this confusion, which is a word that knows itself to be so beautiful that it jumps back to kiss itself, what Barad calls a jubilation of the emptiness? Jubilation is cool because when we think about it in relation to debt, it's forgiving or forgiveness of debt. Because when we think about it that way, there is also in Barad's work a sense of a jubilant forgivenness, a precedence in and through the given that disorganizes life and death, settlement and debt, uncertainty and particle. Forgivenness, absolution, is unforgivable, unpayable, and indeterminate. Consider finally that measure is not measurement, that measure, that the dance of song and dance comes somehow before the determination of matter into separable, measurable things. Es gibt, a forgiveness, an absolution. Is the real in agential realism Lacanian? What if the symbolic is just a nasty little gated anti-community in the real? Or a sitcom produced by the real? Or a spa or a haunted house in the Orange County desert of the real? What if our questions of the real are not measurement, but movement in measure, like a dancer, in violated and constant contact improvisation? Barad writes, ontological indeterminacy is a dynamism, not a state. Matter is nothingness, 99% and arguably 100%. At stake, she says, is, quote, a troubling not only of nothingness, but of beingness, end quote. It is forgiven in the particle's constant coming into and out of existence, or that constant, directionless, and attitudinal, non-altitudinally surfacing flight, an existential coming and going, which we almost understand and brutally misunderstand when we speak of the particles coming into and out of being. With absolute gentleness and absolute intensity, Barad excavates the incoherence of the Copenhagen interpretation, revealing it to be pastiche that is continually given in the gap between Bohr and Heisenberg. For Bohr, there is no determinate state outside of a particular measurement. The measurement constitutes the thing measured. Heisenberg says you can't know position and momentum at the same time, but he says it as if the thing were there, independent of its measurement. The difference between indeterminacy and uncertainty ruptures the Copenhagen interpretation. Barad shows that, quote, in the vacuum, there's an infinite set of possibilities, but not everything is possible. She works, therefore, to undermine the concepts while staying within the physics, she says. So can we speak of an existential rather than an ontological indeterminacy? Is existence unheld and not in between being and non-being, life and death? If so, it will have been a black matter for the king in his exalted derivation from the particle. These remarks are an informal progress report on an investigation into what might be called a physical turn away from certain metaphysical assumptions that both undergird and undermine Black and queer insurgency. It moves by way of an attempt, these remarks move by way of an attempt to join and inhabit, say, the sliding crowdedness of John Coltrane's music or the turbulence of Jack Whitten's paintings, in certain moments when unison gives way to dense proximity. And they want to consider the problematic affinities between the ideas of unity and separability and the ideal of three-dimensionality. Remember that the particles give way to nothing. What if it's not that it's not real until it is observed, but rather that it's not real until it's not observed? Now, What does observation mean? The particle is just a wave of probability, a field or smoke of this or that. Look for you today and here you come yesterday is the difference between evident rhythm, the casual, the causal, the statistically observable, the measured, and incalculable rhythm. All that beautifully spooky, entangled incompleteness of immeasurable measure. Susskind intimates that in the holographic universe, there is only the illusion of three-dimensionality, which we might also call particularity and its networks. And if we follow Barad's intimation that there is no particle, no object independent of our observation, which is also to say our positing, our position in the empirical attitude, then we have some severe erotic disruption to offer the intimacies of which Susskind tells when he writes, quote, "The holographic principle states that the entropy of ordinary mass, not just black holes, is also proportional to surface area and not volume. That volume itself is illusory, and the universe is really a hologram which is isomorphic to the information inscribed on the surface of its boundary." Then we might ask, why assume that information which can't be lost comes in discrete units? Why continually accede to the idea of the discrete unit? It's as if what Susskind calls the negative first law of physics, that information cannot be lost, assumes a metaphysical law of accounting, namely that what is comes in discrete units. Such discretion keeps coming back like a bad penny, or like my son who likes to dance through the living room whenever I get on Zoom, no matter how physics keeps exceeding it. And physics won't stop breaking metaphysical law, as if what it's trying to teach us is how not to accede to the denial of this anticipatorily disunifying excess. Isn't entanglement a refusal and not a fusion of such discretion? Is there a practice? Is there a field of practicality of indiscretion? If we begin to speak of something like a field of the accretion of discretion, and then all up underneath that, if we begin to think of something like a field of indiscrete accretion, then maybe that's something like what pleroma, that overflown fullness that is forgiven in the very toroidal cup of trembling, is. The cooperative antagonism between indiscretion and the illusion of discretion against which it is defined. This is how even the assumption of a generative and original excess still accedes to the very idea of a discrete unit. If we want to study where accretion troubles discretion, where we accede to an original excess, we have to look so closely with the mountain that it moves. Consider the difference between area and volume. The particles insistently rub up on each other, rubbing each other out on the surface, never going into the assumed proposed interior. It is as if the theory of the black hole offers us the origins of perspective. You shine light on the hologram and the image emerges as three-dimensional information. You shine the right mathematical light, use the right code like a Dutch master. The surface of the black hole, that scramble of bits, just ain't got the right light on it, according to physics Dutch masters. The white register will have been the numerical light that lets the particle emerge and seem to stay. Against the grain of this phantasmatic object permanence, the black hologram, what Tendai Sitole calls the black register, releases disorder. Entropy, disorder, is the refusal of the transfer of energy into mechanical work. Is this disorder, this hidden energy, this little all but general strike, completely calculable as a set of definable variables that then we call degrees of freedom? What if the problem is the assumed calculability of those degrees? For Susskind, the degrees of freedom carry the entropy, little bits or loops of string animated by the residual information they bear. black hole fuzz or buzz or blur or sun? Is the problem with freedom in its degrees that it feels like one? Entropy is the revolt of the cockroach people, which is swarm, not solo, and all that plural aroma. Bobby, I don't know, but whatsoever I play, it's got to be funky on the mic, like an old batch of collard greens, or some smothered steak, or some mobile gumbo, or some mumbo jumbo. You come up with an experiment to prove something can't happen, and the experiment makes it happen. The difference between observation and representation breaks down where what doesn't get lost just disappears. Susskind asks, quote, what is the proper dimension of a world that is bigger than our cosmic horizon? Is our cosmic horizon just a two-dimensional scrambled hologram of all that lies beyond it, end quote. Black registers the scramble, the hot bit soup that ain't got no bits, the muck, the territory, the realistic spot, the surreal presence, neither here nor there nor now, the whatsoever, how never, neverion. The black register is the two-dimensional scramble. White registers the white endlessly self-absorptively. The white register wants to register its own three-dimensional emergence as if it were a flourishing rather than a reduction. There ain't no world bigger than our cosmic horizon. Pleroma is in the surface of our two-dimensional entanglement rather than the proper emergence of a three-dimensional individual. The constantly, incompletely more than fullness is the displacement we ain't quite at, our anautochthonous, non-local indigeneity, Whitten and Train sharing non-performance. Yes, I guess I'm still enthralled by the mysteries of the application of paint, the blur of pigment, medium, and platform. I can't muster the velocity that will have allowed me to escape this black hole called the art world if the art world is where I keep falling in love, as, say, with Whitten's absolutely beautiful embrace of outpouring and cutting, his flooding and then tilling and then tiling of the canvas, which requires and allows us to consider the difference between flatness and two-dimensionality. This difference is deep for Whitten. It allows him to enact the immeasurable depth of surfacing. Investigation of the depth of surfacing is divinatory. It allows us to consider, in turn, the difference between sign and surfacing. Something is released in the way Whitten gets behind the application of pigment coming from all sides as an effect of the surround. Three miracles are in play. That the two-dimensional is given in the surround, in embrace, in abduction and adduction. That the general miracle of the application of pigment, the dynamic generality of the intrafacial layer, which is given in and as embrace and approach. And the general dynamism of surfacing, which is given in that the surface is not just a medium for the sign or for representation, but that it is moving, that it is surfacing. The dynamism of fabric awaits the one who styles it, the one who wears it. And yet that styling and that wearing augments the dynamism. It's an augmentation that one might well think of under the rubric of approaching or of arrivance in the absence of arrival. And this gets to the difference between object and way as we wait upon the supernatural sciences. The gravity of Whitten's paintings makes me think of Milford Graves, whose rhythm turns to turbulence. Rhythm bears a spatiotemporal allegory to which it cannot be reduced. A track is planted, some long, lonesome seed of a song that joined up with the rest of them and grows at the end of the world, at the end of the word. I guess I used to think of this as Miles space, moving at Miles space, as in that undoing of the buzzard song from inside out that drives through the rifts or rifts confinement, so that we are so ancient that we are young again. I guess there's a point-to-point navigation that would-be subjects have to want or want to want. You can't be somebody if you can't be someplace. But pointless feel, in its non-local transintensities, braids this inability to think or describe or even hear the music within the framework of the purely oral into the blur or distant nearness or interfacial layer or layer not in between the music and our rhetoric, which is where the music is our rhetoric's surround, as the embrace of some imperative to sway, held in the sweetness of this bitter crop. That's where talk of one track on and in its plot makes sense. But when I hear that I am hearing the solo as solo, spatio-temporally, envisioning the air's escape as if the air could hold escape as its own in some imaginary struggle between itself and grounding, I had to let that go so I could let myself go in the eccentric internal dynamics of the ensemble, which is not one. Now, where that is nowhere. Nowhere being some of neverywhere, in percussive dislocation, the repercussions of which are terribly beautiful. Yes, yes, I know. That's what our graves say. That's what Milford Graves says. And nowhere is where more and less be subconceptually scheming. Here, there, as in Graves's grand unification, the field of dispersive gathering, some unsoloed, unsiloed, long, unlonesome sowing of the self in unsung self-accompaniment. What I want to say I hear Graves say is that it's not about some shift from bop policing to defunded freedom. Such a history so lacks the capacity to nourish that it shows how historicizing needs supplement. So that what I really want to say is that what Graves keeps saying and giving is how the drummer keeps not giving us some, in giving us not all that and then some, as if in some impossibly anticipatory evacuation of return and arrival. Insofar as there's no getting there, there's no going back on this escape, no getting out of it, no getting anything out of this brutal history of everything but all being extracted, of all being viciously gotten out of us in prosecutorial theft of how we want to defy the distinction between the tangible and the intangible. In refusal of the murderous derivative, driven rhythm is our design. Graves says the word computer refers to the people who make long, complex computations for, say, actuarial or navigational charts. They say the actuarial and the navigational are not arbitrarily related. So much of the business of insurance has to do with shipping, with the calculation of risk to financial investment that accrues to the transfer of goods or wares or values or speculative capacities on a global scale. This is our share, our shard, our common wind shear, the common shear we see through, the rhythm of the ship, they say, with their hands sounding like Norbesi Philip and them singing Zong. Then certain tracks emerge in their interaction. The inside outlying laying down and haptic dub and phonic rub of reel-to-reel's fantastic palimpsest. Hard drive and software in passage, computational cotton picking, cane hold data entry, difference engineered financial instrument, 808's 0 degree. Graves say the phrase drum machine refers to the people who make long, complex accompaniments to various rearrangements of air. They say they generate numerical relations, equations, thought experiments, and proofs in an economy of disproof and approval, conjecture and refutation, abandon and apprehension. The drum machine feels, they say, with a propensity for the absorption and diffusion of biological knowledge, which is offered in vibratory code born of frustrate touch, where hand or stick on skin in recoil and repeat reminds us that the heartbeats of the beaten to death can't be unheard in the music. They say that
The drum machine is a middle bypass whose anamechanical caress, given in the abductive throwing of hands, shows breath and pulse in the general plane. Such showing is miraculously antimaterial, divine and funky xenogenetic capacity, blurring botany and architecture, advancing Epicurean gardening, but in atomism's refusal, since tentacular massage, comprising flavored listening, releases generative historical substance bearing the phantom weight of the extraction of the labor of extracting blooms or caramel from endless rows of stalks or vines, or units of movement from static lines of carceral assembly. Having overheard certain secrets of space-time only in order to let them go in anapprehensile largesse, Graves whispers imaginary numbers in presence of goosebumps, tentacular message laid down and out on untrapped sets in untrackable open diaries. Piloerective stress, percorresive duress, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, a chorologue of heart and hand. Existence is the blur of life and death in asymmetry, in symbalance, in presencing continually falling through equilibrium's flat line. Graves says, here, where? Here, nowhere, everywhere. A way to think about turbulence is that it is a profound and palpable consciousness of weight. There is the surface turbulence of witness paintings and how that turbulence corresponds to a topological complexity that flatness cannot describe. The paintings are weighted at service in surfacing. Flex, one wants to say tiles, as if tile were equivalent to the effect of daub or stroke of blue. But of course, it's cut, a cut of blue, not like a cut of meat, though it is an effect of cutting, rather the cut of an eye, a glance of blue or red in the totems for Train and Kenny Dorham, almost fully muted in the one for Amadou Diallo. You have to get up so close to see the glance and shine that you get too close to see the glance and shine, so that you have to see with glance and shine. Éclat et cligner. What if gravity is a gathering of matter, a matter of gathering, as Dawn Lundy Martin says? This is a Jack Whitten question for the physicist Edward Whitten, and it's all about building out of outpouring and cutting, a violent working in which the work is made of unmaking. That's part of it, and maybe it's about Bill Frank Whitten too. Bill Frank Whitten is the painter Jack Whitten's brother, and even if you've never heard of him, you totally have heard of him, or you've seen his work. And in seeing his work, you probably get the clearest indication of something essential to Jack Whitten's work. So Bill Frank Whitten was a fashion designer, and his most famous design was the glove, that sequined glove that Michael Jackson used to wear. So if you can get an image in your mind of that sequined glove, you get a little bit of a sense of what Jack Whitten's paintings look like sometimes. Maybe there's a certain affinity for the sequin, Whitten's rolled fabric in which matter is gathered, warped and wept, but without weaving, into an intermittence of shine. Both brothers worked with fabric that had been distressed by decorative weight. They work with fabric the way folks work at foundries, which turn out to be quilting circles in Gee's Bend or Bessemer, Alabama, which is, as Amiri Baraka says in Train's hearing, a beautiful word in and out of the terrible world. And inside and the side, the cut and even the rolling of Whitten's scarred and tumored canvases make you want to say that cinema can't be made separate either, by way of, but also through Cubism's smooth two-dimensionality. It's just that Whitten's sculpturality need not be understood as seeking after three-dimensionality. Rather, this tiled, tilled surfacing injures and abjures the smooth and flat. disrespecting or distressing our orientation. This tilling and limning in Witten is a kind of Hellenistic Pan-Africanism. This, at least, is what I imagine Emily Greenwood might say of the precise irregularities of his anamosaic gestures. His totems let you see through to the shadowed wall. More depth then. And in how, in the Mingo altarpiece, the tane of the piece gives a blue hint or haze. Cinematic insofar as they are built by cutting, the paintings are fabricated, found, but also sewn, as if in Bill Frank's sewing, for show, for show, for show. Built up from the canvas and then cut to the quick, the rough edge or hedge of these hieroglyphs, along with their being supple enough to furl, brings scrolls to mind. But the cuts and grooves invoke a piano roll as well. What ingenious mechanical device might allow us one afternoon not to break Witten's code, but rather to differ in and with his elegiac, non-coronic or anachronic, or the ends of man-coronic or pan-coronic practice? For criticism is grounded cryptographic differing, and deciphering is separation's cryptologic overview. It doesn't have to be either or if refusing inhabitation of crisis is how we roll, in something kind of like Lenin's pinned freefall and leapt aeration. In an essay called Equal That Is to the Real Itself, which is on Herman Melville and the criticism of Melville, Charles Olson writes, the prior and less but more characteristically Riemannian observation that the metrical structure of the world is so intimately connected to the inertial structure that the metrical field, art is measure, will of necessity become flexible. What we are finding out these days in writing and music and painting. Olson makes me want to say that Witten's paintings are Riemannian surfaces, that they are the pages of an open book. They give us a way of retaining information, of retaining differences. When Susskind speaks of horizon or edge, is that the effect or injection of a Euclidean prejudice regarding the line-edged depthlessness of surface? What if we begin to speak of the indeterminacy or the indeterminate reality of the surface, as opposed to the determinate but uncertain unreality of the point and line? What if to speak of the depth of surface is not automatically to speak of a third dimension? What if instead such speaking, which couldn't help but be singing in dancing, sounds a deep investigation of the surfaces of the world, or more precisely, of turbulent surfacing through the very idea of world? The composer Julius Eastman speaks in the filmmaking and installation artist Otolith Group's hearing of a basicness, a fundamentalness, the ground as opposed to the superficial or the elegant. The Otolith Group, in a film called The Third Part of the Third Measure, their film of and with Eastman, show how looking makes possible four-handedness and Vorhandenheit. Is there a presence to hand and of hand and feet that cuts here and now? It would involve ways for information to remain in difference, in differential basicness, which we might also think of as a kind of realness, where realness implies refusal of mastery, the refusal of mastery of what Eastman called the field nigger, who is also the field nigger in her anti-phenomenological attitude, her low-class conspiratorial altitude, which doesn't seek to stand against or over, where the putatively virtuous relationality of the horizontal is strained and tainted by virulent verticality. This is a problem regarding regard and regarding the dimensional attitude of the angel of history, that 0 degree of social conceptualization, as Hortense Spillers might refer to her, flying in having fallen backwards in swarm and ground. If this were really a talk, its full title would be the angle of history, a defense of preformative, pre-demonstrative, pan-African pan-dimensionality. It would ask after our dimensional attitude towards the angel and her angle. Do we look down on them in looking across from them interrogatively from some third or 90th degree in which the distinction between verticality and horizontality doesn't really signify? The problem she absolves is distance, separation. Her sharp, caressive, double four-handedness, intimated in the pianistic picking of cotton and the percussive cutting of cane, abductively and adductively disavows the separable entity of herself as subject or as object. Her militant preservation of all the information, even in its deliberate winnowing or burning, even as it's blown back all triangular, all laid back and sidereally and surreally off to the side in laterally anagential obliquity, is given in the inclination to decline, to say, nah, motherfucker, that's all right, in a preferential option for that thing which is fundamental, performance. To attain to reach for the ground in matrical limbo, that coordination of hand, foot, and eye. To retain and attain without grasping, with for an anti-metaphysics of presencing, of leveling, of grounding. All that is held and released in witness painting. The history of my eye is such that looking at these paintings folds into looking with them. Entrance by way of blur or swirl, for which embrace is mistaken. What mode of divination is that? The extraordinary compression of palimpsest in these paintings is accompanied somehow by their vastness as atmosphere. I think this is a function of the entanglement of pour and cut. But what's the analog of atmosphere that corresponds to curve and surface rather than globe? It's the vastness of a little patch of ground, of grounding, patching, tilling, limning. In spite of being collected and of being for collection, the paintings hold and bear the uncollectible. Can they release the scoring from the score? How would Braxton or Wadada play these paintings? An album is announced in something like yarn and loom against looming for lingering. The textilic thing that keeps fading in and out in these paintings. Their harping and scuff or gouge. The gorgeous explosion pattern of their etymologies. The non-Euclidean natural disaster of their language. In the name of beauty in blemish, these burnished incompletions of the grid. There's something to write with for distressed syllables in what William Parker might play or Jean Lee might sing. The chordal painting as stringed instrument, vocal cord, and greeting card. From different angles, erasure becomes its own recessive shade or shadow, the graphic loss and echo of esoteric lesson, secret hidden in exposure, which is not a cryptographic thing, but a sociographic thing, as Winter would say, against deciphering's grain, cipher remaining ingrained and blown. You could call it, again, after, but off to the side of Baraka, the heterotopic and heterophonic gravitational field and feel that is forgiven in and disruptive of every homotopic and homophonic instance. You could call it the changing same, where dissonance isn't emancipated, but fugitive. There's an image of a kind of homotopy, which I have in mind. It shows the way that a curved line can somehow maintain itself even in its deformation. And this image, which is a kind of movement and a kind of gesture, contains a kind of wildness. The containment will have taken place by way of attitude or altitude or amplitude. Actually, this is the one image I kind of feel like, if it's possible, I would share. So I'm going to share it. and hope that you can see it. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. All right. So I'll stop sharing there. The containment will have taken place by way of attitude or altitude or amplitude. The line, which is to say the points that anchor it, which is to say a relation of mutual location, remains intact by way of liftoff. But when the line is grounded, it fades and the points blur so that there is no breathless length. If line and point fade in surfacing, then this little moving picture, this little melodrama of aspect dawning is meant to save them, to stave off surfacing with momentary verticality. In this regard, solo flight is a kind of misnomer. What will have been going on here is rather the dualistic monogamy of romantic comedy, complete with the necessary asymmetry. The brutal dream here is of controlled falling. You can only get from 0 to 1 by way of 2. The one's derivation in or from relation. That viciousness of passage in point-to-point navigation is omnicide, which is given in nothing's disavowal, which we disavow in surfacing. In Henry Geltzahler's essay in Jack Whitten's catalog from an exhibit at the Studio Museum in Harlem, Geltzahler quotes Whitten talking about seeing and hearing John Coltrane and talking with Train a little bit at Club Coronet in Brooklyn in 1965, except that it must have been 1964 because Whitten mentioned seeing Eric Dolphy too, who was gone by 1965. Whitten talks about Train talking about sheets. Train maybe having taken or taken back the sheets of sound metaphor from the critic Ira Gittler. Having taken it back or taking it out past metaphor so that we can think of waves of paint, outpourings of it that Whitten, as he later says, cuts, freezes, boils, and laminates. Whitten writes, the sound you hear in his music comes at you in waves. He catches it when it comes by, and he'll grab at as much of it as he needs or can grasp. I think that in plastic terms, translating from sound, I was sensing sheets, waves of light, a sheet of light passing. That's how I was seeing light. That's why I refer to these paintings as energy fields, end quote. Making a way in and out of Train's way. Sheets of paint in the non-space, not in between painting and sculpture. Not in between the sheets, as the Isleys don't quite say. Whitten illuminates Train's use of the musical material. It makes me want to go back and reread Adorno's On Some Relationships Between Painting and Music, only so that I can forget it again. If you go back and look at Whitten's Annunciation number 14 from 1979, having hung out a little with his Totem 2006 Annunciation from 2000, though I can't go back and look, I can't really see the texture, can't really feel or walk around in its flatness. It feels like you're also seeing Whitten hearing and feeling Train. A 20-year cross-section of a long meditation on Annunciation, perhaps by way of going bone deep or having fallen into and in love with Ascension. This whole question of vibratory surface, of flesh, of what it means to feel, dig, need, to need there, not being there. The materiality of what it is to be a compressionist, which is what Whitten sometimes called himself. Compression, surfacing, hapticality, enfleshment. On 6 April 2000, Whitten wrote of his painting, The Second Annunciation, the shit vibrates. What's not in between vibration and compression? To sacralize surface or to sense its sacredness. Sacralization, I think, because surface as instrument or as the refusal of the distinction between instrument and material is played. It's not that Train wasn't playing the saxophone. It's that in playing the sax, he was really playing sound, in sacralizing arrangement of the musical material, which Whitten then approaches in painting. This is the monasticism of the woodshed, and it's always cenobitic, always intrafacial layer. Long before, on 12 February 1979, Whitten announces his freedom from art history. 2 months later, he declares a breakthrough in or a break away from art history's, quote, gravitational field. Whitten's field theories, his field theory, his playing of string theory convinces us that Whitten's sonic proximity to Whitten is a transcendental clue. I don't know if Edward Whitten is a painter, but Jack Whitten is certainly a physicist of the field, in whose announcement of incarnation, an animation of flesh will have occurred, a vibration of surface approaching surfacing. That's the second measure. The third measure is short, and you've already seen it. It's just the 2 poems that Paula referred to, and I'll read them now in English, and then I'll be done. Tilling lining notes. A river is studio agitation through one window. A loft in rock bottom, soft support and rumble. A room, a cell alight in the way the walls walk off in jubid pat and tiling. The pattern on the river floor, all absolute and indiscernible unless you walk it, in the river, as all this rotary soar of the damned and held, sous vide in second linearity, parading in this tubid lining out of the basic line, all in against itself in black and blue switch black, and Beatrice's smiling on seeing all our little differences together in the venereal collection areas, serial eddying of how we taste and feel inseparably. There's just so many ways to keep going along the way. The miraculous influence is delted in Floridian branch or mangrove double silt, Coahoma County moaning or swung Oklahoming. A gap band or a gap in nature kind of sounding, drowning, burning, this continually Caribbean being on fire of the river, from river to river on canal and torn to another bleeding place we from in our Lenape shift, our Delaware gap band, sending geography through a sycophantic horn chart of the natural city in and out of its broken window, cadence still cruising mobile studio. Unnamed and making waves and making ways is what it sounds like. Lining, tiling, moaning, smiling, drowning, bleeding, burning, seeing, sending, sounding just like Joseph Daly, Thurman Barker, Dave Holland, and Sam Rivers. Tilling limning notes. Tile or fleck, as if daub or stroke, but a cut of blue. Flesh cut a glance of blue for train. In the general murder, all but mute for Amadou Diallo. You have to get so close to see the glance and shine, you get too close to see the glint in flames, reading the braille of trembling through the sea of inflection, éclat, écligné, and cling to the firmness of our wave function. A clarity of sweep in black as dawn dawns on us with such gravity, a gathering of matter, a matter of gathering Jack Whitten's rose corona, working violently with outpouring, work made of unmaking a monastic love of sequence in sequence, in solemn, intermittent space-time sewn with the decorative weight of Edward Whitten and Bill Frake Whitten. This scroll of cut out broken canvas looks like looking with a movie. Injured, lined out surface adores flatness with thick character acting, mapping distressed by aerial grounding, scuffed ornament, microtonal abrasion all over again. The textural slur of tilling and limning, Emma and Emily whispering, the precise irregularity of anamosaic gesture is a habitat of schools in a bessemer tree, a reef corral and blue hint shadow, graphic, soft enough to test and moor and wreathe. A totem is a haunted keyboard, And this ingenious mechanical device is so we can differ in elegiac practice. For criticism is grounded differing, and deciphering is separation scale. All right, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It was really rich and dense and beautiful and poetic. If you want to ask questions, please ask them in the chat box, or you can also raise hand. We will collect the questions either on YouTube, Facebook, and here on chat. So please. I will also like to give the ground to Victoria and Francisco and the people who have from Mayu editions who have translated this poem and who made a beautiful job, if they want to talk as well. And Paula, thank you.
Thank you so much, Fred. It's so dense. Well, for now, what we see as questions in the chat is thank you forever, huge thanks, immense and incredible, moving and timely, aren't you? It's. I was wondering all through how you manage to. It's like a marathon. It's so physically dense. How you are with what you're saying. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of.
This is not a question. I'm so sorry.
No.
I'm so slow, and I can formulate some questions. Not good questions, for sure. I would need to stay in the text for I don't know how many months, because there's a whole vocabulary.
Paula, if you want, there's a question on the chat from Bert Stabler. I will help Paula with this.
Okay.
Do you want me to read? No, go ahead. You read.
Bert Stabler. I like the idea of the symbolic orange county in the desert of the real. If you want to say more about dimensionality with regard to Lacan's domains, I would love to hear it.
Thanks, Bert. I think what I had to say is pretty simple, if maybe even simplistic, which is to say that, you know, the domain, so to speak, of Lacan's work that I find the most intriguing is the one that maybe he gives the least attention, and it's the one which, in a certain doctrinal level, he can only give scant attention to, and that's the real, which in a way I suppose I associate in some ways with maybe the notion of a semiotic that Kristeva gives, and goes back a long way to me being in school, you know, where it was the kind of, you know, the semiotic, the maternal, the real, the whatever, the dark continent, you know, all of the empirical richness, you know, the swarm, you know, all of the empirical richness that, you know, that in the main, you know, Western philosophy wants both to disregard and at the same time own or grasp in its disregard. That's the stuff, I guess, that's what I'm interested in, because I suppose that's where I'm trying to come from. And when I say I'm trying to come from there, I mean that's where I come from, but I'm still trying to come from there too, you know. So yeah, so it's the real, or the even the surreal, you know, in Lacan, which perks up my interest the most. And I think that one way to think about witness paintings or Milford Graves's, you know, drumming is that they give us, you know, they contain audio visual information regarding the real. And my sense of it is that the real really truly does have something to do with the holographic universe that Susskind, you know, sort of posits. So.
We have some more questions, Paula, if you want to do. Go ahead. From Joe Giardini. Sound, Paula.
Thank you, and apologies. A question from Emily Wardell, who has a question about this idea, the idea of using quantum physics as a model for thinking rather than Newtonian laws, and what that means for metaphysics. Is it a way of bypassing the idea that there are appearances and being with the obvious hierarchy that it implies, I guess?
I think it certainly does try to move, you know, not only against that grain of, you know, that old metaphysical, you know, and maybe most emphatically given in Plato, you know, that distinction between appearance and being, or between appearance and, well, yeah, that's I do believe that there's a way that that maybe quantum mechanics allows us to dispense with the metaphysical assumptions that produce that discourse. And certainly that discourse is so cognate with the brutality of the last 500 years that it just strikes me as kind of goes without saying that one needs an alternative to it, you know. And I think that I'm not alone in this, obviously, because so many of the folks that I really work with and admire, you know, are also turning to, you know, to the discoveries in physics over the last 100 years as a way to sort of break down, you know, that sort of Kantian consensus, you know, that is the sort of ideological framework that we've had to survive, you know, because that Kantian consensus is so fundamentally grounded, I think, in Newtonian mechanics. So I'm just following in the path of, you know, again, folks like Karen Barad and Denise De Silva, and, you know, a lot of other folks too. You know, the great poet Samia Bashir, you know, Michelle Wright. There's a lot of folks like me who, you know, found ourselves for whatever reason, you know, needing to try to learn about physics, even if we weren't necessarily equipped to do so. And on the one hand, one laments that lack of equipment, and on the other hand, one has to take advantage of like the kinds of interventions that can emerge as a function of that lack of equipment, you know. So I just feel like, you know, there's a real affinity between, you know, Black studies and these new, you know, the new challenges to metaphysics that quantum mechanics, you know, makes possible. And that affinity really goes back to Du Bois. And it's as if he was already anticipating, you know, all of this work that we're trying to do and giving us a kind of, you know, model for how to do it. It's a great essay of his called Sociology Hesitant, which was published in 1905. And to my mind,
it has to be read alongside the great papers that Einstein published in 1905. That you can't make sense of what he's doing without reading the Einstein, but you can't make sense of the Einstein without reading Du Bois. Anyway, so that's, I mean, it was written in 1905, I should say. It wasn't published for another 100 years, but that's another story, which is told, you know, by two great scholars who I've learned a lot from, R.A. Judy and Nahum Chandler. Anyway, I'll stop blathering on that question and blather on the next question. So.
Okay, that's a good plan. A question from Joe Giardini who would love to hear you talk a bit about metaphor and the crossing of sense / sensation. Mm-hmm. Earlier in the talk, there was a moment where you talked about, I think, vision and sound as phenomena of touch, or phenomena of touch. And later there was a reflection on the movement of the sheets of sound, metaphor in its inception / projection by Coltrane, and thinking as well of Whitman's use of woodshedding in the title of his published notebooks, borrowed from jazz practice. Is there something particular about Whitman's practice that gets you thinking about cross-sensory experience? Or is there something more general in physics tracking which art might be said to activate its engaging on thought?
Well, the thing about the physics, Joe, particularly Suskind's work, is that it, you know, if you take it, you know, one logical step forward, it kind of begins to connect, to be connected in a certain way to various interventions in late 20th century philosophy that again are, I think, beginning to try to militate against, you know, that Kantian consensus. And one way to think about the Kantian consensus, the way I think that maybe Husserl thinks about it, is that it's a consensus that operates in, let's say, the movement between what Husserl calls the empirical attitude and what he then calls the phenomenological attitude. And that movement, both instances, in both cases, that's a movement. What somebody like Donald Davidson does, let's say, in this great essay called "On the Very Idea of a Conceptual Scheme," or what I think, you know, Derrida is doing all the time. But what I think really the person who does it like in the most emphatic, beautiful, brilliant way in the 60s and 70s is James Baldwin. Like what they're doing is they're sort of saying, I think, that, you know, this idea that the way we see and the way we know is predicated on separation has to be called into question, right? And so the knowledge that emerges from inseparability is what it is that is at stake. And of course, that knowledge that emerges from inseparability is one in which the sensual determinants are so entangled, so bound up with one another, that there's no way to think about it as anything other than a kind of holosensual or synesthetic field or feel. And that's what I'm trying to get at when I'm saying that it's not just that sound and vision are epiphenomena of touch, but that touch is itself then an epiphenomena of sound and vision. And this is something that's given like really, really deeply and emphatically in Whitman's paintings, which are, seems to me, paintings that you can't see unless you hear them. And you can't see or hear them unless you can touch them. And of course, that's the huge dilemma, because you just can't walk up into a gallery or a museum and touch the paintings, right? Which is why I say that on some fundamental level, my writing about Whitman, maybe everybody's writing about Whitman, is a writing that is necessarily incomplete insofar as not just that we can't touch the paintings, but that maybe on a kind of physical level, we haven't figured out yet how to enter those paintings, right? But what's cool about Witten is he produces all these apertures and topographical fissures and gouges and non-enclosures that at least make it possible to imagine something like an entrance into those paintings. But yeah, I feel like the challenge of Witten is as it stands right now within the political economic structure within which we operate. The challenge of Witten would be how to somehow get the feel, as it were, of touch from seeing them, how to get the sense of sound, so to speak, from seeing them. And when this political economic moment is over, which I hope it will be, we'll be able to touch those paintings. And the final genuine sort of victory of those paintings will have been when, in our constant touch of them, they necessarily disappear. Right? Like, they weren't meant to last forever. They were meant to suffer under our erosive, caressive touch, it seems to me.
Thank you, Fred. There are many more questions. A comment to start with, again by Bert Stabler, just say the surreal / official darkness of Cora. Wonderful. Thank you so much for this. Kevin Haslop, in your presentation, I'm put in mind of Norvis Phillips, whom you mentioned, and also Kenesia Lebrun, who write an ecstatic refusal to accord to the structures, to the strictures of grammar, and who invent endless neologisms and coinages and forms in their work. In song, for instance, in voodoo hypothesis and this graph. And I wonder whether you might say a word about your relationship to the language in which you offered this presentation, and what language is uniquely positioned to do as it relates to your life and work. What language is uniquely positioned to do as it relates to your life and work?
Well, I mean, well, there's well, I would like to believe that if I could figure out a way to ask nicely enough and with enough humility, that Philip and Lubrin and beyond them, before them in a certain way, one might say, Brathwaite, Kamal Brathwaite would allow me to at least try to be part of a kind of greater Caribbean poetic intervention that they certainly, instantiate with absolute beauty. And within that framework, you get not only, the intensity of Lubrin's, as you say, ecstatic refusal, of grammar, I think she takes up the term anagrammatical, in a way that both follows from, but also extends, the way that Christina Sharp uses that term, and before her, the way that Saussure uses that term. It's really, there's something about the way that poetry challenges grammar. Not so much by refusing the idea of grammar, but by multiplying it, right? By finding grammar everywhere. By this constant making and then also breaking of grammatical law.
and obviously, Lubrin does it really beautifully in her work, and Philip does it, with, kind of absolute authority, in her work. And so does Brathwaite. And it's funny because I'm thinking now about, and this is something that I've been learning from my partner, Laura, who just finished this great essay on Brathwaite, in which he talks about his use of the word language, not language with a G, but language with two G's, but language with a D, language, which I think, is something that he wants to get at in a way that approaches more generally this notion of nation language that he has. And of course, his language is completely bound up with Philip's languish, that the intensity of the anguish that the imposition of the English tongue puts on us, at least who live in this sort of Anglophone world. So basically, Black folks in the new world, in the old world too, we have had to learn how to do things not only with words, but how to do things to words. And that's the condition of possibility of us, having something to say, so, yeah.
There's comment Georg Ducker. Dear Fred, I do not have so much. I have a question as a short quotation that I would like to share. It's from William Burroughs, and I am butchering it by just using a few words, but it goes like this. But panic, the sudden, intolerable knowing that everything is alive. This is in relation to pan-dimensionality, Pan, the god Pan, and how panic etymologically derives from the god Pan. Panic as perhaps a word for the experience of pan-dimensionality in art and elsewhere. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Man, I got to go back and read Burroughs some more. It's been a long time, but I'm glad he's still there waiting for me. Yeah, panic and pandemonium too. So it's like William Burroughs on the one hand and John Milton on the other. All of that stuff is there, and yeah, there's that's what I was trying to get at, with regard to, at one point, with regard to Whitten talking about the sort of the explosion pattern of his etymologies. I think I said, that I think he's a painter that makes you want to look words up, and I think right now I'm trying to work on something, with regard to these, relatively, paintings in the sort of middle period, I guess, of his career, in which he did all this stuff with the Greek alphabet, so that's something to draw out too. But yeah, no, thank you. I hadn't thought about panic, but now I'll push the panic button now and see what happens with that. So.
I also, in regard to the things that you've been doing to words, I like very much this idea in relation to this notion of etymology as that has a certain centralization to it, which should be, because it's historical putting together and transformation of the use of words and so on, and it's beautiful because of that. But I like this idea that for some words that we read, we cannot find anything, or we have to invent. But along with with what we find, for example, when you do when you transform names of persons in verbs, and there's some kind of gliding into something else. So something happens there that, of course, there is stuff you can go and check, and the relations that situate those names and syllables, but there's also this thing that you have to go with it and do something with it yourself. There's especially in this presentation, this text, I have a feeling that going to, it's like a new land. It's that's why I was talking about staying, living here for a lot of time. So
yeah. No, well, there's a kind of, I mean, I don't think it's exclusively a so-called, New World phenomenon, but certainly, part of what, Middle Passage implied, for us and imposed upon us, is, the loss of native tongues or mother tongues or so forth. And there's a sense in which, the various colonial languages just wouldn't leave us alone. And so, our, response has been to not leave them alone either, and I mean, to not leave them unscathed, to not leave those languages unbroken, that's the, well, as Derrida used to always say, it's a scandal and a chance, I mean, it's a chance that we have to take. It's a condition that befalls us, and there's nothing I can do about English except destroy it, so.
Yeah. There are some more questions. Thanks to not that many.
There's a question about Fanon.
Yes, where was I? Anya Lee. Hi, Fred. It's Anya Lee. Okay, you see them as well.
Yeah.
On the spell of the fools.
No, I wrote Anjali back in a direct message, but Anjali is a great artist, and she is one of the two members of that group, the Autolith group that I mentioned in the talk, along with Kojo Eshun, and I'm totally, immersed in their thinking, when it comes to trying to think about Witten and what they've done and given us in their engagement with, not only with Julius Eastman, but also with Cadona, with Don Cherry and Colin Walcott and, and other folks too, that for me is totally gives me a way of, that if I can figure it out, if I can work through what they've done, or find something, that I can work with, and given the complexity and richness of what they've done, that does, I think, open up a way of thinking about, Witten's work, that basicness and fundamentalness that they really emphasize, in Eastman's work and in their work on Eastman's work. So, yeah. And just to put it in the terms of the question that Chad asks, it's very much part of an ongoing attempt to read, Fanon. I mean, which is a kind of an endless task. You just keep starting it over and over again. And for me, it's always like going back as if I'd never read it before, because it's just new every time you look at it. But some of what remains is you know, that crucial distinction that I think he makes between, you know, between existence and being, let's say, or between the existential and the ontological, you know, in that chapter in Black Skin, White Mass, which is variously translated, you know, as Chad says. But, you know, he says, you know, what he's asking a certain question, set of questions that emerge when ontology leaves existence by the wayside. And I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna stay by the wayside. I'll get off the road too and linger. And there's a great book by the wonderful anthropologist Jacqueline Stewart called A Space by the Side of the Road. And then there's also a beautiful book by great poet Cecily Nicholson called Wayside Saying. And I feel like both of those texts are illuminating something that, you know, that's sort of given as a kind of, you know, possibility as well as a problem, you know, in Fanon, which is simply to say what happens when you linger in that space by the side of the road? What happens when you linger, you stay with existence, you know, in all of those ways in which it gets off of the ontological track, so to speak. So, yeah. Oh, I said Jacqueline Stewart. I don't know. Well, there's a great film critic named Jacqueline Stewart. I guess I sometimes get them mixed up. Thank you, Joe. But yeah, Kathleen Stewart.
It's Kathleen.
Yeah, I'm getting long in the tooth, so I mix up names now. Y'all have to forgive me. So.
Welcome to the club. I know
right.
that. But well, for me, who have been trying to refuse ontology for years, and bumping against it time and again, and phenomenology. There's all these formulations that appear all throughout, but some like troubling not only nothingness but of beingness. This is really good.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say tools, but more to again our vocabulary, to good toys to go further. And also, I'm thinking of something that I read by you. I don't know where anymore, but it was something like about the episteme to relate to this positionality and three-dimensionality and the distance, the separation, to be able to know. And it was something like, it's not only, the problem is not only that the episteme it colonizes, but it's the episteme itself. And that is, it's really, you have to go even back. It's really the whole logic of this, and also as in relation to things that I had been pursuing, like relationality, and this was already something that you position yourself in the relation to start with, but that is still not. It's still predicated upon separation. That then, well, the units, the separate units, then get into relation and the feast, but then that they remain in their places.
No, this is basically just what I've been trying to obsess, what I've been obsessing over for years, now, and it's given so, emphatically already, in Glissant, and in the idea of a poetics of relation. And he's already aware of the separation that relation implies, and trying to work through that and trying to think through that, and in the same way that I think Winter, you know, is aware of the separation that conceptuality implies, that it, and recognizes that, yeah, there's a, you know, that there might not be a way of extracting conceptuality from coloniality, you know, of extracting the epistemic from coloniality. And so, yeah, these are all these folks who are, and basically this set of questions has been, I think, you know, the fundamental sort of purview, you know, of Black studies. And I don't know that it's exclusive to Black studies. I think, you know, but certainly within the context of my own life and field, that, you know, it's in Black studies and in related fields, you know, in Indigenous studies, women's studies, you know, gender studies, queer studies, that we're just kind of, you know, we are under an injunction to consider these questions, you know, and that these are literally, you know, that these are life and death questions for us, and you know, and they're life and death questions for the world, you know, yeah. So.
Sure are. I mean, they're very violent. They exert violence. Everyone that goes to school or that is socialized, but to a level that it takes time to realize that. I have to call attention to the questions. I'm sorry that I got a bit lost. Chad?
Maybe we stopped on the Fanon question. I apologize that we didn't read that, and I'm saying this for the future, but now we have a bunch of more questions here already. Maybe the last one from Paula Caspão.
Okay. Pablo's asking for me to speak a little bit about the term antimateriality, which sometimes I use. And so some of it has to do just with the, you know, the sort of etymology of the term, or the sort of folded etymologies that are held in the term. So first of all, the root of materiality in mater, that there's just this deep, you know, it's etymological and ideational connection between the material and the maternal that I'm always invested in. And that goes back to really the first question, you know, regarding the real, you know, which I think also can't be thought about, at least within psychoanalytic or sort of post-psychoanalytic frameworks, outside of its connection to the maternal, you know. And then also, you know, anima, which is breath, you know, soul, spirit. And I'm interested, therefore, in a certain notion of a kind of animated materiality, a refusal of a distinction between spirit and flesh, which again, for me at least, is an imperative for Black studies, and more specifically a Spiller's imperative, which is to say, it's an imperative precisely in that way that Black studies, that any Black studies that's worthy of the name is Black feminist studies, you know, it seems to me. So that's part of what all that, and I also have to say that I have a really great friend going back to graduate school, great literary film studies scholar, film critic, and film theorist named Akira Lippitt, who wrote a great book called Electric Animal, which is the first of a series of books that he's written on Japanese cinema and experimental cinema. And in Electric Animal, he coins the phrase animetaphor. And I'm always, whenever I say animateriality, I'm kind of also thinking about the notion of the anametaphorical in Akira Lippitt's work. In terms of whether or not it evokes a kind of anti-productivity, I guess I would probably want to say that I would rather think of it as an anti-productivity, like a kind of forgivenness of productivity. I don't mean for it to be something that is in some kind of stark opposition either to productivity or reproductivity. But it is, what's at stake for me in the antimaterial is a kind of, to maybe use Derridian terms, a general economy of generativity, right? Or an unrestricted economy of generativity and differentiation. And that's what antimaterial or antimateriality implies to me. And if it's connected, I wouldn't connect it to maybe void, but I would connect it to nothingness, to what one might call the realness of no thingness, the realness, the reality and the surreality of inseparability that we could talk about under the rubric of nothing, without raising it to a kind of conceptual level by attaching ness to it, so to speak. And it does connect up with dispossession insofar as this is all that which refuses grasp, right? Which is to say both the possessive grasp within the context of our already existing political economy, but also epistemological or conceptual grasp, which doesn't mean that it's anti-intellectual or that one doesn't think with it, but that's the whole point. This is something that is to be thought with and not thought about, and even deeper, it's to be thought with and not thought at within the context of a history in which we know thinking is something that you do at stuff, in the same way that you point a gun at somebody, I mean, right? Like within the colonial, sort of, the history of enslavement that we live, thought's a weapon, or has been used as a weapon. And so, it's really about thinking with rather than thinking about, thinking with rather than thinking at. And antimateriality for me is playing itself out in those ways, at those levels. So. And I think finally, just to wrap it all up, hopefully in a certain kind of way, the physics and the mathematics that I was at least gesturing towards is able to gesture towards the antimaterial precisely in that way. That the attitude and the altitude of topography and the attitude and the altitude of the quantum mechanical interpretation of the universe as holograph implies with rather than at or about.
So. It's just maybe we are going to the door. But I have this question in what do we do with performance, because there is this appearance here of pre-formative, and I've been trying to think in relation to practices of refusal and to see how to get rid of the vocabulary of performativity, because we are living so intensely in a society, a combination of performance with knowledge, and there's a lot of perverse things about it, and there have been some thoughts around underperformance, not performance or none, also your non-blackness and non-performance. And now I see here pre-formative, a defense of pre-formative pre-demonstrative Pan-African pre-dimensionality. So in relation to pan or pre-dimensionality, what is this formative? What can I relate to?
Well, it definitely follows from the thinking that's in Blackness and non-performance, and which was thinking that was totally kind of influenced by the work of my friend Sora Han, who wrote a brilliant essay about called Slavery and Slavery as Contract, in which she talks about the non-performance of contract. And I started thinking about, this relation between Blackness and non-performance by way of her work. And eventually, another great moment was just being, again, I want to say it reminded me of something in a text I had already read, but really and truly it was as if I had never read it. But a great friend of mine who's also part of the Institute for Physical Sociality named Marielle Pellicero, I butcher her name. She always forgives me for my horrible French, but Marielle reminded me of not just of Benjamin's work, in the critique of violence, but also of the great, critic Werner Hamaker's sort of work, exegetical work with regard to that essay, in a wonderful essay of his called A Formative Strike. And one way to think about it is that between the sort of critical legal discourses of Hamaker, Benjamin, and Sora Han, and as well as Robert Cover, and ultimately I think as well as Saidiya Hartman, that ensemble sort of creates the possibility of a kind of a way of thinking about a critique of performance, so to speak, that recognizes that moves by way of a kind of recognition at the same time of something like what one might call the necessity of doing, a necessity of enactment.
Yeah.
So if you think about antimateriality as being all bound up with this non-restricted economy of generativity, right? The way that I'm thinking about, I began to think that rather than have to erase the term performance, I can just switch around the R and the E in the prefix, So first of all, it understands performance as prefatory, okay, as anticipatory. That what's interesting about performance is not its own coming into existence, but always what performance prefaces, right? So the performance and this means that performance doesn't just come into its own in its disappearance, but performance also comes into its own in the reappearance of what had disappeared. So it's an augmentation, of the really profound sort of ontological discourse on performance that Peggy Phelan offered in her book Unmarked in the early 90s. But this notion of preformance, this prefatory generativity that as it were predates performance, that always anticipates it, and at the same time immediately follows it. It's like it's like that coming and going of the particle, so to speak, right? That shift from particle to wave and into probability, into chance, and to indeterminacy. So that's what the pre does. And then there's this beautiful poem by great French poet Francis Ponge called Le Pré, the meadow, and so that there's even a kind of sense of the generativity of the meadow. And even if you wanted to get really nasty with it, the generativity of the clearing, in that way that Heidegger sometimes thinks about it. So that's what the pre is supposed to be doing, all that work. I don't know if it does all that work, but
yeah. It's it does something.
Yeah.
That in
All
a way,
right.
maybe it's already in the, well, the pair of the performance is supposed to mean already that, but the thing is it's not used as that.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. It's fun to have a chance to think about all of this with y'all. And when, like I said, when next year, if I'm able to be there in person, then person is spelled PRESON. If I'm if I'm able to be there in person, I'll be able to, we can talk about it and really listen to the music and look at stuff together. But I know it's time for y'all to eat dinner. It's time for me to watch some football and so see who Italy gets to beat this weekend. So anyway, but thank you all so much. And thank you, Paula, especially. I appreciate it.
See you soon in Lisbon, yeah, in a bar.
Yeah.
Walking around and I don't know.
Thank you so much, and let's meet next year in Lisbon.
Yes.
I will leave you with the last few lines of your translated poem, and I was just scrolling down and I found it very interesting. It's like, e circundar. Oh, I can put it here so that people can go back and look again at it. So, e circundar totem é teclado assombrado, e este engenhoso dispositivo mecânico é para que possamos diferir em práticas elegíacas, pois a crítica é divergência fundada e decifrar é a escala da separação. Pronto, boa noite, muito obrigada a todos e espero que nos encontremos ao vivo no próximo ano. Obrigada.
Obrigado.
Obrigada.